Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to be talking about ethics in clinical research. So just an overview of what we're going to be talking about. So first we're going to talk about why ethics is important in research, a little background and history about how ethics came to be in research, some ethical principles, ethical processes, privacy, confidentiality, and anonymity, quality improvement, and then lastly the critical appraisal of ethical conduct in studies. So some elements of ethical research. Ethical research is protecting human rights, understanding informed consent, understanding institutional review of research, and also balancing the benefits and risks in a study. Let's talk about why ethics in research. So ethics in research, it promotes the aims. That's the knowledge, truth, and avoidance of error. So there's no fabrication of results. Data isn't falsified, and it promotes truth and minimizes error. Ethics also ensures that values that are essential to collaborative work are employed in studies, so that's trust, accountability, mutual respect, and fairness. Many ethical norms, such as guidelines for authorship, copyright and patenting policies, data sharing policies, confidentiality rules, and peer review are all designed to protect intellectual property and interests while encouraging collaboration. So most researchers obviously want to receive credit for their contributions and do not want to have their ideas stolen or disclosed prematurely. Ethics also holds researchers accountable to the public, so that includes research misconduct, conflicts of interest, and human subject protections. Public support is another reason why ethics is important in research, because people are more likely to fund and also participate in a research project if they can trust the quality and integrity of the research. And lastly, and most importantly, ethics in research implements moral and social values into study designs. That includes social responsibility, human rights, animal welfare, compliance with laws, and public health and safety. Ethical lapses in research can significantly harm human and animal subjects, students, and the public. So this is where that moral and social values in study designs makes it so important. Let's also talk about ethical versus unethical research. So in ethical studies, subjects are protected and we carry them out using scientific method and principles. Unethical research might include scientific misconduct, fraud or research protocol violations, fabrication or falsification of data. Plagiarism is also unethical conduct in research, and also putting subjects at risk without consent. We're going to talk now about the background and history of ethics in research. First, we're going to talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study. So in 1932, 400 African American men with the syphilis infection were recruited into this study with misleading promises of special free treatment to cure their syphilis. So the study was being conducted by the United States Public Health Service, and the goal of the study was to examine long-term effects of the syphilis infection. This is actually the study where we got the information on what primary, secondary, and tertiary syphilis is, how they present, and what those symptoms are. However, this data was collected extremely unethically. In the 1940s, when penicillin emerged as an effective treatment for syphilis, these men were actually denied and blocked from having treatment of syphilis because the researchers wanted to see what the long-term effects were. So they left these men infected with syphilis until the late 1960s. There are obviously several major ethical issues involving the human research subjects in this study that need to be discussed further. So the first major ethical issue to be considered is the informed consent, which refers to telling potential research participants all about the aspects of the research study. These men were not fully informed on what the study's goals were, and they weren't really exposed to a complete understanding of what they were getting involved in. Another concern has to do with the possibility that a person might feel pressured to agree or might not understand precisely what he or she is agreeing to. So these investigators took advantage of a deprived socioeconomic situation in which the participants had experienced low levels of care. The contacts were with doctors and nurses who were seen as authority figures as well, which is really unfortunate. Let's talk about the aftermath of this study now. So when it was exposed in the 1960s, what was going on, people were obviously outraged in the scientific community and also in the African American community. What it led to was the development of the National Research Act in the United States in 1974, and now all federally funded proposed research with human subjects must be approved by an institutional review board. Now, these IRBs didn't actually exist prior to this act being enacted. Also, aftermath of the study, there was a class action lawsuit, and surviving subjects received payments of about $40,000, which is not very much in the 1990s when that actually happened. Some more unethical research. Obviously, World War II, many of us are aware of the Nazi experiments that were conducted on Jews, political prisoners, and other individuals that Nazis considered undesirables. So they were subjected to a range of experiments that resulted in death and disability. One of the big studies that was going on in the concentration camps was medico-military research. So they were doing these hypothermic experiments. The Nazis wanted to know how to protect and revive pilots who were shot down into the sea and who suffered from hypothermia. So the Nazi solution was actually to immerse experimental subjects in freezing water to the point of death. They used about 300 prisoners in these experiments, and they recorded their experience of shock and exposure to the cold. And most of these subjects obviously died as a result. After World War II, the Nuremberg Trials were held by the Allies against the representatives of the defeated Nazi Germany. The first of the trials was actually a trial on the doctors and involved 23 defendants. So most of these defendants, 20 actually of these defendants, were physicians accused of murder and torture in the conduct of medical experiments on concentration camp inmates. It led to the Nuremberg Code being developed, which is one of the most important documents in the history of ethics in medical research. So this was developed in 1947, and it serves as a blueprint for today's principles to ensure the rights of subjects in medical research. There's also the Declaration of Helsinki, which was developed in 1964, and it's recently been revised in 2013. So the Declaration of Helsinki is also a statement of ethical principles for medical research involving human subjects. That also includes research on identifiable human material and data. And we're going to talk a little bit more about types of data and ethics regarding types of data shortly. So it's also widely regarded as a cornerstone document on human research ethics. Now we're going to talk about ethical principles. So there are 4 ethical principles that are related to medical and clinical research. So that includes human dignity, beneficence, justice, and informed consent. Human dignity. So this is the respect for persons, which is the respect for participants. It involves the participants having self-determination so they can participate or withdraw without coercion from the researchers. The researchers give full disclosure for the study, there's no deception, and they all receive fair treatment. Participants consent voluntarily, and persons with diminished autonomy have special protections. So this could include people with cognitive impairment. They have special protections before they're included and recruited into research studies. The next ethical principle is beneficence. So beneficence is that concern for welfare. It's also known as the doing of good. Beneficence is a concept in research ethics that states that researchers should have the welfare of the research participant as the main goal of any clinical trial or research study. So that includes freedom from harm, freedom from exploitation, and also looking at those risk-benefit ratios. So highly anticipated benefit may balance the high risks of a study. Justice is our next ethical principle, so this involves fair treatment of all participants, even if a participant chooses not to participate or withdraw from the study. It also encompasses the right to privacy, which we're going to talk about again shortly. Lastly, informed consent. So this is essential to any research project. It's comprehension of consent information. Participants have to have competence to give consent, or in those special situations where there's extra protection for certain individuals. And it's also important that it's a voluntary consent and not coerced consent, like previously discussed in the other ethical principles. Now we're going to talk about the ethical processes in research. So when you're conducting a study, you have to first go through a research ethics board. So these research ethics boards ensure that any research that involves humans meets ethical standards. So that's protecting the rights and welfare of participants, ensuring voluntary and informed consent, and also ensuring that benefits exceed the risks. It follows something called the TCPS2, so the Tri-Council Policy Statement, guidelines to safeguard research participants. And at the University of Saskatchewan, we have the Behavioral Research Ethics Board as well as the Biomedical Research Ethics Board. In nursing, we typically deal with the Behavioral Research Ethics Board since we are conducting more social science research projects. The Tri-Council Policy Statement is implemented by research ethic boards, and it's all institutions that receive Tri-Council funding. They must sign what's called the Memorandum of Understanding. So this mandates the application of the TCPS2 for all human research at institutions. There are three core principles, so respect for persons, concern for welfare, and also justice, which is that fair treatment principle that we just discussed. There are some important sections of the TCPS2, so that's privacy and confidentiality, recruitment, consent, and engagement. Now, there's also one more section of the TCPS2 that is really relevant, especially considering that so much research is being conducted in this area since the Truth and Reconciliation Statement. So that is Chapter 9 of the TCPS2, which is research involving First Nations, Inuit, and Metis people of Canada. So in this chapter, there's actually 22 sections. It strengthens research capacity with this population. It recognizes the role of elders and other knowledge holders, and it has respect for community customs and codes of practice. So when you're actually applying to do a study with First Nations communities, you need to outline how you're going to respect these community customs, codes of practice, their governing authority, and also their complex governing structures. All that needs to be laid out on your application to the Research Ethics Board. It also involves research agreements between these communities. Let's talk about privacy, confidentiality, and anonymity now, where they all sort of sound like they're similar, but by definition, they're actually different. So privacy is a right. It's the individual's control over their own information, and that control has an extent of timing, circumstances, and sharing of personal information. Protecting participants' privacy needs to happen during recruitment and data collection, and also the presentation of data in that final paper. Also, privacy involves storing the data, so data must be securely stored to prevent the identification of participants. So at the University of Saskatchewan, you either need to say that you're going to store the data in a locked filing cabinet of the principal investigator, or also on the OneDrive server at the University of Saskatchewan that is encrypted. Confidentiality is that agreement for handling one's information. So that agreement occurs via informed consent, but we can't always guarantee absolute confidentiality. So participants need to be informed of this in the consent process. An example of this is when a study is hosting focus groups. Obviously, the focus groups participants are all reminded that what happens in the focus group stays in the focus group. However, when they leave, we can't guarantee that they're going to share information. They're not going to share information with their family or friends about their experience in the study, right? So this is where confidentiality can be compromised, and we need to inform all participants of this. Lastly, anonymity is where a researcher has no idea who the participant's identity is. There's no identifying information collected, so that includes name, address, telephone number. We leave it all out. And even the researcher does not know the identity in any way. So data collected in person can never be anonymous. That's because the researcher is obviously sitting right in front of the participant. That also includes phone calls. The researcher is having direct contact with that participant, so it's not anonymous. In anonymity as well, if a combination of indirect identifiers such as gender, race, age could identify a specific individual, data isn't anonymous, and we don't call it anonymous data collection either. This is a potential with small sample sizes especially. So again, we need to be specific when we're laying everything out for participants, how their data is going to be collected, and the identifiers, how they're going to be mitigated, right? There are different types of data that we collect. So the first of the types of data that we're going to discuss is aggregate data, which is summed or categorized data that is analyzed and placed in a format that precludes further analysis. So this is often what you could receive if, say, you're working with the cancer agency and you ask for statistics on breast cancer occurrence in Saskatchewan. They're going to give it to you in a table or graph or numbers to prevent the chance of revealing an individual's identity because of individual records cannot be constructed, right? So we're just looking basically at number statistics with aggregate data. Anonymized data is information or material that have been irrevocably stripped of direct or indirect identifiers. A code is not kept to allow future relinkage, and the risk of re-identification of individuals from remaining identifiers is low or very low. An example of this is respondents to an online survey. If they don't fill out any identifying information, like again, that name, address, telephone number, email, that is anonymized data. De-identified data includes elements that may constitute identifying information because there may be reasonably foreseeable circumstances in which the data could be utilized alone or with other information to identify that participant. So that may contain personal health information. An example of this is perhaps a semi-structured interview transcript where we have stripped the participant identifiers and any significant points of mention. So for example, if we're interviewing a patient with cancer, we would strip their doctor's names that they're talking about, locations, etc. However, let's say it's a rare type of cancer. Someone who's reading that study later might think, oh, I know someone with that type of cancer. That's probably them. So that's that foreseeable circumstance where the data could be used to identify the individual. Now, identifiable data includes elements that directly identify an individual and explicitly contain personal health information. So this could be like an online survey about health status that includes an email for follow-up. Now we're going to talk about quality improvement and ethics in quality improvement. So quick refresher, what is quality improvement, or QI? So QI is a continuous improvement process. It's a proactive approach to improve processes and systems, and QI projects, along with clinical research, play essential roles in healthcare to enhance and improve patient care. Let's talk about QI versus research. So research requires RIB oversight, while QI actually does not. Again, research ethics boards, that's REB. Clinical research uses the scientific method to investigate a health-related problem or phenomenon systematically. QI projects also employ rigorous methods, but it has become more difficult to delineate what constitutes QI versus research. So without oversight from a research ethics board to ensure ethical conduct in QI, how can project teams ensure that ethical conduct in their QI initiative? So this is actually a paper that I wrote in 2020. It's published in the Canadian Oncology Nursing Journal, where we're basically saying even though ethical oversight is not required, it is still strongly recommended. So we provide a list of guidelines. What we did was we went through several tools that look at how to constitute QI versus research, lots of recommendations, and we compiled a list of recommendations to end up with 5. So these recommendations that we presented in our article are: 1, review the purpose and design of the activity; 2, consider that need for informed consent; 3 is consider how the participant confidentiality is protected; 4 is consider whether the right of the participant to withdraw is necessary; and 5 is to seek exemption from an REB. So what is really recommended in QI projects is that you write to the REB, you say, listen, this is what we're planning on doing. Do you think this is something that you need to oversee, or are you okay with us proceeding? And the REB will either say, you know what, no, this sounds more like research. I want you to fill out the whole application. Or they might say, yeah, you're good to go, and they'll give you an exemption certificate, which a lot of journals, when you go to publish your QI project, will want to see that exemption from an REB. Quick recap, although a review by the Research Ethics Board is not required for QI, it is no justification for less rigor or less attention to the protection of participants. Lastly, we're going to talk about critical appraisal of ethical conduct in studies. So there's 6 things that we're going to look at when we're appraising how a study carried out their ethical conduct. So first of all, we're going to look in their methods. Was the study approved by the appropriate RAB? That needs to be listed in their methods. Secondly was informed consent obtained from the subjects? This is also typically outlined in the methods section. If the subject is incompetent, did the legally authorized representative give consent? Were the rights of participants protected during the sampling and data collection and also the analyses in this study? Was privacy protected during the study and in the final report? And lastly, was benefit-risk ratio of the study acceptable? So that is it for this presentation. Thank you for tuning in, and please contact me if you have any questions. My email is steven.hall@usask.ca, or you can get in touch with me through Canvas. Thanks, and take care, everyone.